Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. Except for the occasional random bloody incident, American labor is often missing from our history books. But in dusting off the archives, we find a rich record that details the bitter, deep-rooted David and Goliath conflict between a small but determined group of union organizers and behemoth capital bent on their destruction. The Farm Equipment Workers Union, FE, practiced a militant and democratic form of unionism that contested the boss's power and forged interracial unity in the heart of the Jim Crow South. Did I mention that many of the union leaders were self-proclaimed communists? There's a good story here. Let's discuss. Well, hello, everybody. We're here on another podcast. Hi, Greg. And we are really pleased to have Dr. Gilpin, who wrote the Long Deep Grudge, A History of Capital, Radical Labor and Class War in American Heartland. So, Toni, is just so glad. I'm so pleased to have you. I read this book, and Greg sent it to me, and I said, "Oh my gosh!" It was we talked for an hour on the phone about your book. It is so good, and it's such a real treasure. And so, a little bit about your background. You're a Ph.D. American history recipient from Yale.
Right.
You are a historian, writer. You are write for a lot of journals, more progressive journals.
Mm-hmm.
And you've written a couple of books. You wrote another book about the clerical strike in Yale. Was that what? Tell me a little bit about that.
Right. I mean, I was fortunate to go to graduate school at Yale in the mid 1980s, which dates me. So to study with the renowned labor historian David Montgomery, sort of the premier American labor historian, who's passed away now. And David had assembled around him this sort of astonishing group of young aspiring academics. Many of us came from not your traditional academic backgrounds. I went to Chicago Public Schools, was not the usual type to go to graduate school at Yale.
Mm-hmm.
But we were all kind of fortunate because we went to study labor history, but while we were at Yale, some labor history was actually being made in that the clerical workers there organized a union, won that union in a close vote, and then went out on strike while I was there in what was an extraordinarily well organized and ultimately successful strike, one of the few in the mid 1980s, one of the few bright spots for labor. So I, along with my husband, who was very involved also in student support work, he was a law student then for the union, and a couple of other good friends in history who were also ardent union backers. We wrote the book on the Yale strike called On Strike for Respect, the clerical and technical worker strike at Yale University. And it's really sort of what we were most drawn to, or what the story we want to tell, was the organizing model that the hotel and restaurant workers there utilized, which was not unlike the model that I speak about a lot in this current book, a really rank and file based democratic union organizing model that proved successful and then sort of spawned a whole host of graduate student organizing drives and other university organizing drives. So that was my book from a long time ago, and then this newer book is just came out last year.
Well, I'm not in the field of it. I'm not in the field of union history and so forth. I came from the field of education, and one of the real treats in getting to know Greg is he has filled me in on this such rich history that doesn't show up in our history books. The influence of how important the labor movement and the radical part of the labor movement was in shaping many of the things we take for granted now. And it's been just a real, like I said, it's been a real treat for me to have this part of history exposed to me. So, and this is old hat for Greg, because this is in his wheelhouse. So your
well,
book...
I have to say, I had the pleasure of meeting David Montgomery. He was in Pittsburgh before he went back to Yale, right. I believe. And so he was active here. He wasn't just an academic. So
right.
He was a brilliant academic here as well. And I remember he chaired the support committee we had for District 5 United Mine Workers during that period. I got to know him personally. In fact, he and his wife had a progressive Seder. And I'd never been to any kind of Seder, but it was a new experience for me at his house. And he was indeed a great man, as well as a great professor of labor history.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Yes, I mean, he had as you know, a background. He was not originally an academic. He was a labor organizer, a political person who had gone into, became a machinist and a labor organizer with United Electrical Workers. So took that. And then when he got blacklisted and couldn't get a job anywhere, actually, that's what made him decide to get into academia. And so he combined both this encyclopedic knowledge of history generally with a real understanding of workers' power and what on-the-job experiences are like. And that's pretty rare in academics, even labor historians today. So I was very lucky to be there and studying with him, as I said, both for that reason and then because the clerical workers did me this enormous favor of organizing a union while I was there. So. Well,
your book is The Long Deep Grudge, the story of big capital, radical labor, class war in the American heartland. And you write about where I grew up and where I had my, the Northern Illinois, and I have friends in Catlin and friends in Pekin. And so you're writing about a part of the country that I lived in. And we will link to your book in the description notes, and I just recommend this so highly. It's just such a fun read. And could you maybe start by just reading a little bit from your introduction and just provide a little bit of background? How about that?
Right. Yeah, I usually, I sometimes start by saying that this book is about a small defunct union and its relationship with a corporation that went out of business decades ago. And usually I found, though, that didn't interest people very much when I would put it that way. So it helps if I start by reading from the introduction to the book, which I think places this particular union and this particular company in perspective and introduces readers to how dramatic this story of this union and this company really were. So the introduction is entitled Undried Blood on the Pavement, and I'm just going to read a little bit from it. A Black man murdered in the pre-dawn darkness on a South Side street. In 1952 Chicago, the rule was that such an event didn't matter much, not downtown anyhow. Reporters wouldn't be dispatched to cover it. The police would take their time investigating it, and in corporate suites, the death would have passed without notice. But this particular killing got plenty of attention. The victim was 52-year-old William Foster, an employee in the malleable iron foundry at the sprawling McCormick Works complex, the cradle of corporate behemoth International Harvester. He'd been a few blocks from his home, heading to work early on a mild October morning, when he met up with someone who struck him on the head and fractured his skull. Foster died a short time later without identifying who had attacked him. He left behind a wife and 2 children. No witnesses came forward, at least not right away. The police, the press, and executives at International Harvester, however, were immediately certain where the guilty party could be found. Captain George Barnes, head of the Chicago Police Department's notorious labor detail, had no doubts about the motive for the assault. This was obviously a labor slugging, he promptly declared, because the Farm Equipment Workers Union was in the midst of a bitter strike against International Harvester, and Foster had chosen to cross the FE's picket lines. Within hours of Foster's death, International Harvester offered a $10,000 reward for the arrest of his assailant. This company will make every effort to safeguard every employee who comes to work. This crime must not go unpunished, said Harvester President John McCaffrey in a statement publicized across the country. Then the Chicago Tribune weighed in. There is good reason to believe that the Foster murder was communist inspired. The union at the particular harvester plant where he was employed is the Farm Equipment Workers Union, which was kicked out of the CIO because it is controlled by communists. So that's the introduction, which kind of introduces these two parties at the heart of this story. The Farm Equipment Workers, known as FE, this uniquely radical union that had managed to organize corporate behemoth, as I call it, International Harvester, which, though it's out of business now, was one of America's founding industrial empires, once the fourth largest corporation in the world, employed hundreds of thousands of workers across the globe. And the FE was one of those unions that broke through in the 1930s to organize International Harvester, as the UAW did at Ford and General Motors, and the steel workers at US Steel, et cetera. But the FE's history, as I explain, it was a particularly militant, radical one. Its leadership, as indicated there, was associated with the Communist Party and continued that relationship, or at least that influence continued in the union through its existence. So that's the intro at any rate, and I'll toss it back to you for questions.
Well, the writing is, you write so well. I don't know why this isn't a screenplay, because normally when you read these kind of history books that are so well footnoted, and but the story is just like, what's going to happen? What's going to, this small group and self-proclaimed communists, and they had a passion. They had a passion for what they brought to the labor movement. In fact, in one of your quotes, you said that their idea was that management shouldn't even exist. This should be a workers' co-op running things in a way.
Hey, there was a screenplay like that though, Pat, and it was called Salt of the Earth.
Yeah.
Similarly, influenced union.
With the jail, and that's probably why we don't have a screenplay today based on FE or based on Alice Chalmers' local, the UAW, or anybody else on the left wing of the CIO.
Yeah,
so but it's a remarkable story, and I got to tell you, it reminded me so much of reading Stalin over Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
Though, don't tell anybody, but I think you're a better writer. But nonetheless, the terrain is the same essentially, and the bad guys are the same bad guys. The good guys are the same good guys.
Right.
And the struggle is the same struggle, and the end is the same end. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, Walter Reuther's name comes at the end only too often in the history of the left-wing unions and the CIO. So, what happened? What happened that smothered this really strong workers' movement? It took it all the way to the point where people could say openly, you don't even have a right to exist. In our view, we're going to fight you on every grievance. We're going to fight you on everything. We're not worried about today you're told the corporation, you have to do all you can for the corporation. That's who you are. We have an identity of interest. Then they didn't see it that way. What happened, Toni?
Right. Well, that's the big question. And I do, in telling this story, I was determined, first of all, to try to write a book that could appeal to people who are not academics. That was what I set out to do. And it's true that the FE, which was one of those left-wing unions associated with the Communist Party, along with about a dozen others that ultimately was expelled from the CIO in 1949 because the CIO declared that those unions, the labor establishment declared that those unions were communist dominated, and so kicked them out, including the very sizable, the third largest union in the CIO at the time, the United Electrical Workers. So those unions had similar philosophies of how unions should function, that they retained this belief that management was their enemy, not a group of folks that they could cooperate with and achieve good things for workers. But one of the things that as you know, because you've read the book, obviously I told this story because I have a personal connection to it. My father was among the FE leadership. And when I grew up, though, because the FE had been, by the time I was born, had been absorbed by the United Auto Workers. So my father had joined the staff of the UAW. So I grew up in that orbit of the UAW, going to UAW picket lines and UAW functions. And that was the union that I knew, the union world that I knew. And my father, though I knew that he had been a member of the Communist Party in his past, I knew that he'd been associated with this smaller union. He didn't really talk a lot about that. He was never ashamed of his Communist Party past, never denounced that, but that was just something he was so, his job was so absorbing that I didn't really hear much about that. I knew, though, that he had this particular pride in that the FE, he thought that that particular union experience was the best experience that he'd had, and that that union was something special, but I didn't really know why. And he died when I was in college. And so after that, I got, I started getting interested in labor history. I started getting interested in poking into this story about what made this union so different, so unique, so radical. And
so loved. And so loved.
So you've pointed to one of the key quotes. One of the other members of the FE leadership described the union by saying the philosophy of our union was that management had no right to exist. So that dictated their philosophy of interacting with management, of their belief that workers' grievances should be addressed immediately. This meant, this played out in measurable terms. For instance, the enormously high number of walkouts that took place at international harvester plants where the FE was the representative. But also they had this fiercely loyal rank and file, a very involved rank and file, in part because of this continual turmoil in the shops and this belief that workers' grievances should be attended to immediately, which generated this kind of loyalty. So one of the other quotes that I feature in the book from one of the local leaders, an African-American named Frank Mingo, one of the Chicago international harvester plants, said that the rank and file loved that union. And so that kind of devotion to this particular union, which not only affected the strength of the union in terms of its dealings with international harvester, but also meant, in the stories I tell of the particularly extraordinary FE local in Louisville, allowed for the union to build a kind of interracial solidarity that was really extraordinary for that time.
But before we get to that, and I think that's the best part of the story, but before we get to that, Greg and I have had on people talking about the Amazon thing in Bessemer, and it was before the vote came out. And in reading your book, I just can't help but wonder, how would have this been organized? How would have they responded differently in making more connections to the workers? And part of the book, I think the lesson of your book too, this changing the subject again, is you said this was a long, deep grudge, that these things just didn't happen overnight. They just didn't come in and fix things. This was a slow process of establishing relationships, working with people. And that's where they achieved their success. They'd have failures, but ultimately they were philosophically and passionately focused on the needs of their workers in a battle against behemoth capital that was pretty brutal. Right. So tell me about the grudge and maybe that sort of the slow trot about why they were so effective through their tenacity and their passion.
Right. Well, the title, and this speaks also to sort of Greg's earlier point, actually the title, The Long Deep Grudge, I borrow from the great Chicago writer Nelson Algren, who and the Long Deep Grudge refers not just to the FE, the activities of the FE that took place in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, but that this grudge can be traced all the way back to the 19th century, and that's one of the more famous events in American labor history, the Haymarket bombing. And that's because, and Greg, I was going to say that I agree with you that there are certainly many similarities to the other left-wing unions, but one of the things that makes the FE story unique in their relationship with International Harvester is this, the fact that they can trace their legacy all the way back to this Haymarket affair, because the origin of International Harvester began with the McCormick family's harvester machine company based in Chicago that was the site in 1886 of a skirmish between police and strikers that led to several workers being killed, and that the next night was what led to the protest rally at Haymarket Square, where the infamous bomb was thrown that then decimated the great uprising of 1886 on behalf of the 8-hour day, in the first America's first Red Scare that followed the Haymarket bombing. Workers' unions were destroyed. The burgeoning anarchist movement in Chicago was completely obliterated, and unions at McCormick Works, which had gained the 8-hour day, were destroyed. So the FE made a point when it came into existence in the 1930s of very consciously evoking this memory of the Haymarket martyrs, of their fight for the 8-hour day, and that they were reviving the legacy that those workers had fought for. And it was the same McCormick family that was still in control of International Harvester that had been in charge of that McCormick machine company back in the 19th century. And young Cyrus McCormick II was very much involved in capital's determination to make sure that those anarchists were hung for that bombing. So it was Nelson Algren who wrote in 1951 of, and I'm just going to read that to you because it's the front piece of my book. He wrote about the big dark grudge cast by the four standing in white muslin robes, hands cuffed behind at the gallows head for the hope of the 8-hour day. The long, deep grudge born from McCormick the Reaper. Grudges like heavy hangovers from men and women whose fathers were not yet born when the bomb was thrown, the court was rigged, and the deed was done. So Nelson Algren, writing in his book, Chicago, City in the Make in 1951, still thought Chicago was deeply affected by that Haymarket bombing, and the FE leadership, when it took up the mantle of organizing at International Harvester, made conscious reference continually to those Haymarket martyrs. And so that grudge was carried through to their relationship with the McCormick family. So that's part of what I think makes this story so unique and such a great story to tell, because you not only have the union and all these fascinating stories among the union leadership, both local and national, but you also have this incredibly wealthy McCormick family, sort of one of those, typically eccentric wealthy families, and all the kind of stories that that involves. But also, and this is getting back, Pat, to your point about Amazon and Bessemer, International Harvester was really one of the most important pioneers of the kind of anti-union tactics that Amazon is using today. They morphed from the kind of draconian just labor repression that they used in the 19th century, just bludgeoning workers and making sure they got hanged if they were fighting for unions, to the more sophisticated forms of union avoidance. And when one of the first corporations to introduce an industrial relations department, one of the first to introduce a host of company unions all the way back in 1919.
Those were kind of stealth, though. Those were just used as tactics to, that was fascinating when you talked about the company store and the company cafeteria and these worker groups. And that was just a way of controlling. It was a ruse in a way. It was just another way of controlling the workers and exploiting them through their piecework stuff. And that's fact. Talk a little bit about that. And John Becker.
Yes, yeah, he's one of the people that I whose story I tell, who's kind of certainly unsung and a hero to me. Yeah, because International Harvester, like Amazon, isn't doing anything. There's nothing new under the sun when it comes to management technique. And so all of the same kind of things you see Amazon doing, which is to combine, obviously, the carrot and the stick. So both trying to ferret out and get rid of union supporters, but at the same time, offer these enticing rewards to workers who will be loyal to the company. And that was what International Harvester decided was a much better, much more successful way of maintaining their control over the workforce than just outright repression, or certainly combining the two, ferreting out the union supporters, but rewarding those employees who would demonstrate the right forms of loyalty. So, the company introduces this host of programs in the 1920s under the rubric of welfare capitalism. So pensions, cafeterias, some kinds of vacations, but again, employees who weren't loyal enough wouldn't get those things. You had to qualify for them. So if you exhibited any kind of recalcitrance or resistance to the kinds of demands that management made on you, then you would either get fired or you just wouldn't get those rewards. So when the company, and one of the ways, again, also of avoiding what was obviously in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, 1919 with a rising worker consciousness around the world, employers are getting very nervous about union organization. And so International Harvester comes up with this notion, and a host of the other really huge corporations did this too, but a small number of them, to introduce these company unions into their plants. So why would you need to pay dues to an outside organization when you've got an organization right here free of charge that will also bring your concerns to management? So again, exactly the same thing that Amazon is doing now. And they actually had workers elected to be representatives that would meet with management in these monthly meetings at these company unions. Now, again, one of the things that's important to note is to qualify to even be able to run as a company, to be a worker representative for these company unions, you had to meet all kinds of qualifications. You had to be an American worker, no foreign-born workers. You had to have worked at the company for a long period. There was a minimum age requirement. So, anybody that might have radical tendencies was kind of eliminated even from consideration. And that's why this fellow, John Becker, becomes so interesting. So at McCormick Works, the very same plant that was at the center of the Haymarket violence, at their company union, this fellow John Becker gets elected somehow to the company union in 1922. In his very first meeting, he raises a demand for a wage increase. And through this demand, he's well researched it, and he can show that workers are not making enough money to be able to make ends meet. Other workers who had been quiescent before, there hadn't been much discussion of anything except how great the company was before that, start standing up and saying, yeah, you know what, we're not making enough money. We can't afford to feed our families and pay our rent. And this is very upsetting, obviously, to Harvester management, who didn't intend for this to happen. And the only reason I know anything about John Becker is because the minutes for the Works Council survive. Other than that, I know nothing about him, because shortly after this happens, after this dust up over this wage increase, he disappears from the Works Council record. He could have been fired. He could have just been transferred. He could have, there are all kinds of things that could have happened to him. But at any rate, he does not get to continue on as a worker representative, which isn't surprising because that was not the purpose of those company unions. But that kind of behavior by the company ultimately exposed those company unions for what they were, which was just a sham operation to encourage workers to think that maybe management would hear out their concerns and then address them and actually do something about them. But as the years went by, it became more clear that that was never going to happen. And so then you get into the 1930s and the Great Depression and the rise of industrial organizing with the CIO, and those company unions finally get overturned. So that's the long answer to who John Becker was, but why I think that, you know, those kinds of ripples that one worker can send out, that kind of courage that he displayed to say, you know, we're not getting what we deserve, would have an impact that would go into, you know, would take maybe well over a decade to really register.
You know, but before we get to Louisville, tell me a little bit about how this little engine that could, FE, used the large number of shop stewards and how they were fighting against piecework, how piecework was kind of was gypping the worker, and how they used these tactics of just shutting down these sites when there was conflict and getting immediate resolution. And probably that's why they were so much loved by their employees. So if you'd go to the shop stewards, the piecework, and some of their unique techniques that made them so effective in knocking off this behemoth. I mean, International Harvester was powerful.
Very
powerful.
Were
small and passionate.
Yeah. Yes. And again, I mean, just to return to Amazon, and then maybe for the last time, I mean, I made this point recently in a piece I wrote for Labor Notes with some historical reflections about the Bessemer vote. And we should remember that however powerful we might think Amazon was, you know, they pale in comparison to the raw power that corporations like International Harvester and Ford and General Motors and US Steel once had. So the fact that those corporations were ultimately overcome should give everybody some encouragement about what can be done at this moment, regardless of how difficult it may seem. So to get back to what you raised about piecework, and that's one of the other things that makes this a unique story. International Harvester had this very bizarre Byzantine pay system, which wasn't piecework in the traditional sense where you were just paid for every piece you produced, but you would receive this base wage, but then based on output, you would receive additional incentive pay for what you produced. So it was a way to obviously motivate workers to work harder. But it was an enormously profitable system for International Harvester. And the communist inspired FE leadership with their Marxist sensibilities saw this pay system as uniquely fine-tuned to extract every bit of surplus value out of their workers that harvester management could get. And it was also a system that led to just endless confrontations on the shop floor, because every worker's pay was different than every other worker's, because they had, you know, depending on how much you were producing and what particular jobs you were doing, you could be doing what seemed like the same job as the worker right next to you, but receiving a very different amount of money for that job. So needless to say, this led to resentment and unhappiness, and also this sort of endless push to work harder, to work faster and harder, was really difficult on harvester workers. It was one of the motivations for organization in the first place. So one of the stories I tell, there's this conflict between International Harvester and the FE, but there's also this growing conflict between the FE, this left-wing communist-inspired union, and the labor establishment that really begins to develop after World War II. And as the labor establishment breaks decisively from any kind of Communist Party connection, and unions like the FE are still influenced by that philosophy. So the FE's belief is that these endless grievances that workers have in International Harvester plants over their pay rates, over the pace of work, over wanting to work less hard than they are constantly being egged on to do, those grievances should be addressed immediately. And the best way to do that is by walking out of the plant, by shutting the work down and by walking out of the plant. And, one of the workers I quote talks about how effective that was, that, when we do that sort of thing, we walk out of the plant when a worker has a grievance, it gets addressed right away, immediately. And this was stood in stark contrast, though, to the growing consensus around the kind of more cooperative framework that Walter Reuther of the UAW would embrace in the post-war era. And this is kind of most famously exemplified in what came to be called the Treaty of Detroit, the 1950 General Motors UAW contract. That was a 5-year contract. It provided for workers' productivity pay and cost of living increases, which good benefits, definitely, for GM workers, but it also obliged the union to ensure uninterrupted production. So you weren't going to have walkouts over individual grievances in UAW plants, at least as far as the UAW was concerned. And the left-wing FE leadership saw things differently. They were not interested in a union arrangement that obliged a union to enhance the corporation's profit margins, that assisted the company in urging workers to work faster and harder. So they resisted those kinds of clauses in international harvester contracts. They didn't conform to no strike clauses. And they also believed in having this enormously large and powerful steward body. So they had a much larger shop floor representative group than UAW plants did. And those union stewards were, in fact, continually agitating and leading workers into walkouts over those kind of grievances. And so you had these amazing statistics that between 1946 and 1954 at FE plants, at international harvester plants represented by the FE, you had over 1,000 walkouts, which is extraordinary. This is a 30,000 member union. So, we're talking about walkout rates that surpass, the entire 10-year period that we've just gone through, and the 60 million workers in America. You've got FE, the 30,000 members of the FE walking out far more than all those workers combined. So, those walkout rates surpassed anything comparable to what was happening, say, in the much larger UAW. So it just represented a different philosophy of how you deal with worker complaints, and with the notion that management should have the ability to set the pace of work and set the conditions of work. The FE resisted that notion, just thought that that was not what a union's job was.
And that's where I know, Greg, you don't have much love for Walter Reuther and his how he became kind of complicit with management and essentially was responsible in a way for the destruction of the union movement because of his.
He was the essential player that turned around what was class struggle-oriented unionism, trade unionism, and turned it in, morphed it into something that was class collaborationist, that in fact argued that the interest of the workers, the interest of the corporation were really the same. And so in that post-war period, there was this linkage between productivity and compensation for workers. There was almost a direct linkage, what Piketty calls the 30 glorious years, Franck Glorious of that era. Here and everywhere else was really linked very much to that productivity increase being linked to worker compensation. And so, and of course, it was in complicity with the US government because it was really based upon, it was a deal cut for the unions to also be handmaidens to US foreign policy. So it all fit together beautifully, but it didn't fit together in the long run. And of course, when years later, when the tables turned, the corporations and the US government turned their backs on the workers in the 70s, and it all went away. And that whole notion of today, the union movement is begging to get back to compensation commensurate with productivity gains. Right. They're begging for that. Right. Yet they gave it up. They gave the fight up and 60s, and this is the payoff for that. So I'd be curious to know how you see, Toni, how you see the loss of that militancy, that mine mill smelter, FE, the old steelworkers in their era before Murray changed things, and the auto workers before even until Ruther took it over, how that would play if that would still be here. Let's do a counterfactual. If we still had those kind of unions today, how would things be different?
Well, one of the things I do talk about, and what it's not my phrase, but the phrase that I use to describe the Ruther philosophy and what becomes the labor establishment philosophy is the politics of productivity, is this notion that increasing productivity, increasing levels of output is the ticket to prosperity for everybody, for management, workers, the consumers alike, that as long as we just keep producing more, everybody can benefit. And that was a very appealing philosophy because it did away with the concept of class conflict. It seemed to suggest there was this way to for everybody to do well. And of course that that is the philosophy that triumphs in the labor movement and in the general liberal vision of America for the 1950s and 60s. And it looks like it's working, right? Because we've got, certainly for UAW members who are getting good wages, good benefits. It's not working so well if you look at their actual work lives, where they're being worked harder and harder. And then you start to see these cracks in the UAW vision. For example, what happens at Dodge, Maine with the Detroit Revolutionary Union movement. You've just got workers who begin to hate their jobs with such passion because they're so overworked, and because that there's really an explosion there. So you've got a problem both with the fact that the union can't really address the quality of life issues for workers on their jobs, because they've given that up. They've said that you can file a grievance, but of course the grievance procedure is so bureaucratic and takes so long to ever establish anything. And so in the meantime, workers are still suffering from these incredible line speeds and terrible conditions in the shops and just a generally inhumane work-life experience. So the union isn't able to address that because they basically ceded all of those decisions to management.
Right.
But at least you're getting the trade-off. At least you're getting pretty good wages and good benefits. As we then move into the era of deindustrialization and those plants begin to shut down, then the union, the UAW, is really bankrupt in terms of an ideology that can address that, because the whole notion has been, you management, you corporation should try to make as much money as possible, because all of that money is going to trickle down, or at least a good portion of that money is going to trickle down to the workers and then out to other people. And again, that seemed to kind of be at least a reasonable formula for a brief period. But as the plants begin to shut down, because the obvious logic is that if we are encouraged to make as much as we possibly can, well, we can make even more if we take these plants overseas and hire workers who we can pay a heck of a lot less than you. And the union just does not, the UAW and the labor establishment has no ideological response to that. So one of the differences, I think, could unions have turned America into something entirely different in the 70s and 80s? I don't know about that, but at least they could have had a more coherent response. And at least I think if you had followed the FE model of trying to claw back as much corporate profit all along, than what the UAW did, which was to just augment all that corporate profit taking. You guys take as much as you want, as long as you're allowing some of it to trickle back down to us. They used those profits to not to reinvest in their plants, not to make sure that those plants kept operating, but to enrich themselves, to buy all kinds of other kinds of companies, in other places that were more profitable but weren't union-based labor. And so the payoff comes later on, or rather the reverse payoff for the labor movement. So I think we could have had, at least with that vision that management has no right to exist, with this notion that these people are never our friends, they are workers' enemies, we might have had at least a labor movement that would have more nimbly responded to things like plant shutdowns.
And that gets to Louisville, Kentucky. By the way, the very first tractor I ever learned to drive a tractor was a Cub.
Oh, really?
Small little tractors. And
Yeah.
before the corporations moved everything to Mexico and then to third world countries, they moved their factories to the South. And so the International Harvester bought this big military facility, and they were going to go to the South and start a big plant there and suppress wages and have, and tell me about that story and how that didn't pan out so well, and a little bit about the two gyms. This was the best part of the story for me.
Yeah, well, it's a great story because of the great individuals' stories involved. That many of I uncovered just a lot of this stuff as I was actually doing more research for the book, and some of these stories were based on interviews I did decades ago when I first did this in college. But at any rate, this Louisville part of the book is one of the most compelling, and I think obviously relevant today stories, because it is a story of how to build an interracial union. And these days, when we're confronted with notions that there are, that the white working class can be deplorable, can be, irredeemably racist, I think that the story of the FE in Louisville really calls that into question, because you're exactly right. In 1946, International Harvester, along with just about every other big industrial concern in America, begins looking to the South, and the non-union low-wage South as the panacea, as the way to escape from these bothersome unions that have organized in northern cities. So along with so many other corporations, International Harvester opens up a manufacturing facility in the South, in their case in Louisville, Kentucky, which was not completely non-union, but it certainly didn't have the kinds of unions that the FE, the kind of union that the FE represented. And the FE follows the company south, begins an organizing drive. There are other unions also trying to, including the UAW, trying to organize this plant. And what makes the FE stand out in its organizing approach is that it makes very clear from the get-go to workers at the plant. And International Harvester was somewhat unusual in that they had committed to actually hiring Blacks in the plant for production jobs, which in the South, even in Louisville, was not the usual thing. Most African Americans, if they could get jobs in manufacturing concerns, were relegated to janitorial positions only. They didn't work in production jobs. But International Harvester said they would hire African Americans for all jobs in the plant, and they actually made good on that commitment. But that raised a problem for the unions, or at least a concern for the unions that were organizing. How were they going to talk to white workers who are going to constitute the vast majority of workers in the plant about what the union was going to, how the union was going to deal with African Americans in the plant? And the FE made it very clear from the get-go that they were committed to interracial unionism. The union would be fully integrated. They would be committed to the promotion of African Americans within the shop. And they painstakingly made this clear to both Black and white workers that as they approached them in the organizing drive, they had a white organizer and a Black organizer who were the central leaders of that drive. And it's pretty extraordinary that the FE then wins that election. And the story of that is one of the highlights of the book. But then even more extraordinarily, the union immediately turns around and confronts International Harvester on the very reason it went to Louisville in the first place. And that is that the company had announced that it was going to pay workers in this Louisville plant what it called the Southern differential. So a lower wage rate than workers received in its northern plants, because after all, that was the reason it was there in the first place. And the union instantly challenged Harvester on that pay rate. They take the entire plant out on strike. They stay out on strike for 40 days. And this is, again, they're so new to this. I mean, these workers have just barely been in this union. Most of them have never been in a union before. Many of them, they're young workers who have just returned from World War II service. So many of them, this is their first job they've ever had in this kind of situation. And yet they managed to take these workers out on strike. They stay out on strike. In the process of this strike, they build all kinds of close personal relationships and between Black and white workers, and forge the kind of unity
and their wives. That was an interesting story. It was the Black women and the white women forming solidarity with their common. That was a critical part of this success. Right.
So so that's why I think this story is important and relevant for young activists today, thinking about how to build interracial solidarity. I mean, the workers, the white workers who went into this plant as one of there are two Jims that I kind of feature as you talk about. One of them, Jim Wright, is one of the Black workers who becomes very early on committed to the union in Louisville. And he talks about how extraordinarily racist they're not extraordinarily, actually, how ordinarily racist the white workforce in Louisville was at that time. Many of them had come from rural Kentucky, and they carried with them the heritage of racism that they had grown up with in the South. And yet, this union overcomes that and builds the kinds of not just, union relationships, not just relationships in the shop, but close personal relationships that Jim Wright forges, for example, with a white worker named Jim Mauser. They become very close personal friends. Their families, their wives become friends. They go to each other's houses. This was not the kind of thing that was happening in then segregated Louisville. And so if it could happen then and there, it can happen now. That kind of interracial solidarity can be built. And this is one of the models that indicates how that can happen and what kind of power it has once it occurs.
So Greg, you've talked about this before, about it was uniquely the union movement with this kind of passionate communist organizers that were one of the few organizations in our country that was creating racial solidarity. This is like pre-Martin. Talk,
Well, why is that? It's fair to say a union movement that doesn't have, in the United States, doesn't have people that have either a history of being arrested or a history of having an FBI number assigned to them or being interrogated. If they don't have that as a background, they're probably not going to lead workers very far. And that was true of virtually everybody in the militant 30s, 40s, and 50s. The strong people were people that, as when we interviewed Roger Kieran, he noted one of the organizers for UAW, the communist organizers, said, we can fight the company, we can fight the newspapers, we can fight the local government, but we can't fight our own union. And essentially, that's where the final attack on this militancy occurred. And it was interracialism, which is identified completely with the communists in that era. Almost all the pre-civil rights era organizations were communist-inspired, communist-led, and or engaged with by communists somewhere along the line. And so all these things came to represent a kind of militancy. That was the militancy of the moment, in the way that the IWW was the militancy of its moment, or the anarchist in the time of the Haymarket. Also, the Western miners, which gave birth to the mine mill smelter. They were all the moments, but they encapsulated what drove working class power forward. And that was beheaded in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And so we're left with a situation where, and I'd like to have Toni's comment on this. What do you think a veteran FE leader would say about the UAW today if they knew that 4 years ago, 4 years ago, they created a two-tier system that essentially introductory pay for United Auto Worker was the same as it was when Henry Ford established the assembly line. If you change that for inflation, it's the exact same number, the pay. And two, the level of corruption in the UAW today. I mean, all through the leader, not one leader, not two leaders, not a leader here, a leader there, all through the leadership,
right.
Levels of corruption. To me, that's the legacy of beheading this left militancy in the labor movement. And this country's paying enormously for it. But how do you think an FE veteran would feel about that, Toni, today, looking back at what they created and what the UAW is today?
Right. Well, I mean, even as someone who grew up in a UAW, you know, what was then a UAW family, I mean, it's just heartbreaking to see this corruption scandal that has plagued the UAW now for a couple of years is truly heartbreaking. And I'm not even gonna, you know, for all the negative things I have to say about Walter Reuther, you know, he was never personally corrupt or on the take, and the fact that, you know, the current UAW leaders have been, that is something that would, you know, that even he would you know, obviously be horrified by. And it's also, again, keep coming back to the Amazon discussion, it affects unionization efforts everywhere, because when you've got that kind of corruption scandal at high levels of a union like the UAW, even if it's not the UAW that's doing the organizing, a management is going to point to that and see, that's where your dues money goes. That's what they say, you know, that, you know, and I'm sure they were saying that in those captive audience meetings. See what happens with your dues money, it goes into the pockets of union leaders. So every time that happens, regardless of the union, it corrupts it, you know, it undermines organization efforts elsewhere. So you know, I think that there would have been a range of opinions about how it would have been possible for a labor movement to resist the power of capital ultimately. But again, I return to this notion that it's important, you know, it's vital for unions to recognize and operate on, union leaders to recognize and operate on the notion that the people on the other side of the table are their enemies and the enemies of their members. And as soon as you start thinking that, you know, they can be your pals and you can cooperate rather than cling to a notion of class struggle unionism, I think that's when the trouble starts. And after, you know, Reuther at least had a coherent philosophy. Most of the people who followed him, not just in the UAW, but in other unions, didn't have one other than it seems to work okay if we cooperate with management to kind of, you know, get some stuff for workers. And so you've got, you know, a labor leadership today largely devoid of any kind of governing philosophy besides, let's see if we can manage to fend off some of the concessions that we keep having to make. So obviously no labor leader from the 30s or 40s could be happy with the state of the current labor movement. I think those union leaders, though, who did have the kind of philosophy of that the left-wing philosophy that the FE leadership had, would, you know, many of them would say, well, we could kind of see it coming. You know, we could kind of see that this would happen if we abandon those kind of principles. And to get back to the Louisville example, I mean, another thing that I think is really important is building that kind of interracial solidarity, which is something that I like in the FE. I like to, in the Louisville example, I like to refer to it as lived solidarity. So it wasn't just that they built this union and they committed to being anti-racist, and then they, and then that was great. And then that was the end of the story. This kind of constant activity, these constant walkouts, this constant battling with management also was essential to building that kind of interracial solidarity. So you had to do that all the time. You had to make workers on the shop floor recognize that when they had a grievance, that they needed workers across the shop to walk out with them in order to ensure that their particular problem would be solved. And so we were constantly underscoring that need to practice solidarity. And when you stop doing that, you also undermine those interracial ties, I think.
And you said, I think you said this, that, I mean, there were racist in the South, and then there were racist, and these were the more hardcore, and they voted 70% for the FE. And not only that, their families were having picnics with each other, and they had a sense of cohesion in the workplace that was a true solidarity.
Right.
And then what happened after all this was broken apart? What happened? What was it went right back to where it was, like with, who was it? Henry Wallace and his famous essay in Fascism in America. It's here in our country, and it becomes with the division between how race is divided against each other by powerful elites. And, tell me that isn't where we are.
Yeah, and I think it does go back to this notion that it would just be so much easier for unions if we could just negotiate a contract every 5 years and get some nice goodie package. But it's so much, it's much easier on the leaders, it's much easier on the workers if we just leave it at that. And then and our job is done, except that every 5-year time when we get together and we share some drinks with the managers and we come to some new agreement. And and so again, the FE's philosophy that you had to practice unionism, rank and file unionism, radical unionism every day, or else those bonds of solidarity and that notion of class struggle would dissipate among workers, and they'll retreat to that kind of racism that they were schooled in, the kind of isolationism that management tries to foster, the kind of individualism that undercuts solidarity. When you do that, when you abandon that kind of constant, encouraging workers to recognize that they are in a constant struggle that requires that they bond with their fellow workers and all the time, every day, then you're laying the trap for exactly what capital wants, which is a fractured working class, a working class that thinks that its interests lie with placating their bosses rather than with uniting with other workers. So that's, those are all the stories that I think are woven into this story of the FE. And it was a small union, but they did achieve mighty things based on that kind of solidarity. But, as Greg said, ultimately, when you're taking on not just powerful corporations, but the government, the federal government, local governments, a reactionary press, and a labor movement, also establishment labor movement that has decided to take you on. It was ultimately too much for one union to be able to achieve, and yet to be able to overcome. But I do tell the story even after the FE makes the decision to merge with the UAW, that still that militancy among the rank and file continues for some decades past that. And so that's also part of the story.
We've been at, I want to respect your time, but let's get to the violent, horrible car wreck ending of this wonderful part of our American history. It eventually was, snuffed out by what? You said the consolidation with the larger union. We had Taft-Hartley. Yeah. We had the red baiting. What was? It's gone now.
Right. Yes. Yes. And well, and I started out this discussion with a bit from the introduction of the book, which begins with this 1952 incident. And if you, but to find out what actually happens with that killing, with that strike in 1952, you have to read all the way to the end of the book, because first I go back to the 19th century at Haymarket, and and then I tell the story of the FE's organizing, et cetera, and International Harvester, and so you have to get all the way to the end of the book to see what happens with that killing. And I'm not going to say here, because I encourage people to read it, but that sort of was the showdown, the final showdown between International Harvester and the FE that took place in 1952. That killing was just one of many incredible violent outbreaks that takes place. The strike, International Harvester makes clear that it is out to break the FE once and for all. It's going to keep its plants open. It's going to encourage people to come to work. It's going to bring in scabs. It's going to do everything it can to finally to break the FE, and it does become this very violent strike. And again, I'm not going to tell the story, though it's obvious, since the FE doesn't exist anymore, that it wasn't successful. Ultimately, it does merge with the UAW in 1955, and so that is part of the story told in the book. So people have to read that. But yeah, it is the story. I mean, and one of the things I say in my conclusion is, regardless of how we might have wanted labor to behave differently, we have to always keep in mind, and Amazon is the next example of just how very powerful capital is, and we could wish that labor leaders behave differently, but ultimately the enemy of working people are those capitalists, and they are, as International Harvester is a great example of, ever evolving in their responses to workers to come up with the best way to undermine organizing efforts. And they will continue to do that as long as we've got capitalism. So it's a story of ebbs and flows in working class history, and but the struggle is always ongoing, and it's ongoing right now in just different forms than it took in the 1930s and 40s and 50s.
Well, Toni, you have been just wonderful. I don't know if you know this, but Greg and I send out bling. We send out little thank you notes with
oh no, I didn't know that.
Small trinkets. And believe it or not, and we've done this to Roger, and we had Jennifer Berkshire with the wolf at the door. And the bling that you're going to be getting in the mail is a little FE, an FE pin.
That looks great. I can't really see it. It's kind of blurry, but I believe you.
Well, there you go.
That's better. Yeah. Oh, wonderful.
So you'll be getting, I'll send you a couple so you can hang.
That's fabulous.
I urge you to join FE.
Yeah, I wish I could.
And it'll be a little conversation starter where they'll say, "Oh, I knew someone in that union." Well, I wrote the book on the union. So
yeah, there are not that many people around anymore who are in the union, because International Harvester having occasionally I meet someone whose father worked in International Harvester or something, but it's they're few and far between. But yeah.
I had friends living in Catlin and Peoria area during the late 60s. It was just a bloodbath about how horrible they were to their workers. And
Caterpillar's a whole nother terrible story too. Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much, and
well, thanks for having me. This was great, and I hope you can let me know how to access this and all that. You will, I'm sure. So
okay, and keep writing.
I'm trying to figure out what the next project is, but yeah.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.